The Arizona Territory stretched endlessly under the scorching sun, its red rocks and sparse vegetation telling stories of ancient times. Thomas rode his horse along the dusty trail, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. At 22, he had already spent 4 years working cattle drives across the territory, but nothing had prepared him for the storm that was building on the horizon. Dark clouds rolled in like angry spirits, and the wind began to howl through the canyons. Thomas knew better than to be caught in the open during an Arizona thunderstorm. He had seen lightning split trees in half and flash floods turn peaceful streams into raging rivers in minutes. His horse, a sturdy mare named Belle, seemed to sense the danger too, her ears flicking nervously as thunder rumbled in the distance. "Easy, girl," Thomas whispered, patting Belle's neck. "We need to find shelter, and fast." He guided his horse toward a narrow canyon that cut deep into the red rock face. The walls rose high on both sides, creating natural protection from the wind and rain that was already beginning to fall in heavy drops. As they moved deeper into the canyon, Thomas noticed something unusual. The walls here were different from the smooth, wind-carved surfaces he was used to seeing. These rocks looked like they had been deliberately placed, stacked in a way that seemed almost purposeful. Lightning flashed overhead, followed by a crash of thunder that made Belle jump. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the sandy floor of the canyon into muddy streams. Thomas dismounted and led Belle toward what looked like a small alcove carved into the canyon wall. It would have to do until the storm passed. As he approached the rocky shelter, something caught his eye. The stones at the back of the alcove weren't random at all. They were carefully fitted together, forming what looked like a wall or barrier. Thomas had heard stories from older cowboys about ancient ruins scattered throughout the territory, places where people had lived and died long before any white man set foot in these lands. He was about to turn away when he heard it. A sound so faint he almost thought he had imagined it. But there it was again, a weak, muffled cry that seemed to come from behind the stone wall. Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Is someone there?" The crying stopped for a moment, then resumed, more urgent now. It was definitely a human voice, though he couldn't make out any words. The sound sent chills down his spine. Who could be trapped behind these ancient stones? And how long had they been there? Without thinking, Thomas began examining the rock wall more closely. The stones were large and heavy, but they weren't mortared together like modern construction. They were simply stacked and wedged into place. Some were loose enough that he could wiggle them with his hands. "Hold on!" he shouted toward the wall. "I'm going to try to get you out." The voice behind the stones became more animated, speaking rapidly in words Thomas couldn't understand. The language sounded unlike anything he had heard before, not Spanish, which he knew a little of, and certainly not English. But the desperation in the voice was unmistakable. Thomas grabbed a sturdy piece of deadwood from the canyon floor and began using it as a lever to pry the stones loose. The first few rocks came away easily, creating a small gap near the top of the wall. Through the opening he could see only darkness, but the voice was clearer now, definitely coming from someone trapped inside. "Don't worry," Thomas called through the gap, though he doubted the person inside could understand him any better than he could understand them. "I'm going to get you out of there." The storm raged overhead, but Thomas hardly noticed. All his attention was focused on moving the heavy stones. His hands were soon scraped and bleeding from the rough rock surfaces, but he kept working. Each stone he removed made the opening larger, and the voice inside grew stronger, though still speaking in that strange musical language. Finally, Thomas had created an opening large enough to squeeze through. He grabbed his lantern from Belle's saddlebags and lit it with shaking hands. The flickering light revealed a small chamber carved into the rock, and huddled in the far corner was the most unexpected sight he could have imagined. It was a young woman, perhaps 18 or 19 years old, with long black hair and dark eyes that reflected the lantern light like a frightened animal's. Her clothes were torn and dirty, and she looked like she hadn't had water in days. When the light hit her face, she shielded her eyes and spoke again in that unfamiliar language. Her words coming fast and desperate, Thomas stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what he was seeing. How had this young woman ended up sealed? Inside this stone chamber? And more importantly, who had put her there and why? "It's all right," he said softly, setting the lantern down and raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you." The woman's eyes darted between Thomas and the opening he had created, as if she couldn't believe it was real. She tried to stand but stumbled, weak from whatever ordeal she had endured. Thomas moved toward her slowly, the way he would approach a spooked horse. "Water," he said, making drinking motions with his hands. "Do you need water?" Recognition flashed in her eyes at the word, and she nodded frantically. Thomas hurried back to Belle and grabbed his water canteen, then returned to the chamber. The woman reached for it with trembling hands and drank deeply, some of the water spilling down her chin in her eagerness. As she drank, Thomas studied her more carefully. Her clothing looked handmade, with intricate patterns he had seen before, on items traded by the Navajo people who sometimes came through the cattle camps. Her jewelry, what little she wore, had the distinctive silver and turquoise work he associated with that tribe. But what was a young Navajo woman doing sealed inside this stone tomb, and how long had she been trapped there? The question swirled in Thomas's mind as he watched her slowly regain some strength. From the water, when she had drunk her fill, she looked up at him with eyes full of gratitude and fear. She spoke again, this time more slowly, and pointed to herself. "Ayana," she said clearly, placing her hand on her chest. Thomas understood. She was telling him her name. He pointed to himself and said, "Thomas." She repeated his name with a slight accent that made it sound almost foreign, then looked toward the opening he had created in the stone wall. Her expression changed, becoming troubled and fearful again. Thomas realized that getting her out of this chamber was only the beginning. Whatever had led to her being entombed alive was still out there, and he had no idea what dangers they might face once they left the safety of this canyon. The storm outside was finally beginning to calm, but inside the small canyon, Thomas found himself facing a situation far more complicated than any weather. Ayana sat against the stone wall, her dark eyes watching his every move with a mixture of gratitude and deep worry. She had stopped shivering after drinking the water, but Thomas could see the fear that still gripped her. He settled down across from her, keeping a respectful distance. The lantern flickered between them, casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls. Thomas had dealt with language barriers before during cattle drives when they encountered Mexican ranchers or native traders, but this felt different. This wasn't just about buying supplies or asking for directions. This young woman had been sealed inside a stone tomb, and he needed to understand why. Ayana spoke again, her voice soft but urgent. She gestured toward the opening Thomas had created, then shook her head vigorously. Her meaning was clear even without shared words. She didn't want to leave. But why would someone who had been trapped want to stay hidden? Thomas pointed to the stone wall and made a questioning face. "Who did this?" he asked, knowing she probably wouldn't understand the words, but hoping his tone would convey the question. Ayana's expression darkened. She pointed to herself, then made a gesture Thomas didn't recognize, her hands moving in a way that seemed to indicate other people. "Family, perhaps?" She spoke a few words in her own language, and even though Thomas couldn't understand them, he could hear the pain in her voice. Over the next hour, as the last of the thunder rumbled away into the distance, they began to find ways to communicate. Ayana knew a few English words, water, no, and bad among them. Thomas tried his limited Spanish, discovering she understood some of it too. Slowly, painfully, a story began to emerge. Ayana drew lines in the dirt with her finger, creating simple pictures to help explain. She drew what looked like two people standing together, then crossed it out. Thomas watched as she pointed to herself, then to one of the figures, shaking her head firmly. She was telling him about refusing something, but what? She tried another approach, holding up her hands to show her age, 18 fingers held up in two groups. Then she pointed to herself and made a gesture that looked like she was pushing someone away. Thomas was beginning to understand that someone had wanted something from her and she had said no. Marriage? Thomas asked, remembering the hand gestures he had seen during a Mexican wedding celebration once. He mimicked holding hands and placing something on a finger. Ayana's eyes widened with recognition. She nodded vigorously, then immediately shook her head and said no, with more force than she had shown all day. She drew another figure in the dirt, this one larger, older-looking based on her gestures. She pointed to it with obvious disgust. Then to herself, shaking her head again, Thomas was starting to piece it together. Someone had wanted her to marry an older man, and she had refused. But that still didn't explain why she had been sealed in this stone chamber like some kind of punishment from ancient times. Ayana seemed to sense his confusion. She drew more figures in the dirt, what looked like a family group. She pointed to them, then to herself, and her face crumpled with an emotion that was part anger, part heartbreak. She spoke rapidly in her native language, the words tumbling out as if she had been holding them back for days. Then she did something that made Thomas's blood run cold. She picked up small stones and began building a wall in the dirt, just like the one that had trapped her. She placed a tiny stick figure behind it, representing herself, and pointed to the family figures she had drawn. Her own family had done this to her? Your family? Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. They put you in there? Ayana understood enough to nod, tears streaming down her face. She wiped them away angrily and continued her dirt drawings. She showed him how the older man she was supposed to marry was connected to other people, important people, from what Thomas could gather from her gestures indicating power and status. Through broken English, gestures, and her simple drawings, Ayana managed to tell Thomas what had happened. She had been promised in marriage to a man old enough to be her father, a man from a neighboring clan who held influence in the community. When she refused to go through with the ceremony, it had created a scandal. The man's family was powerful, and their anger at the rejection threatened to bring trouble to Ayana's people, her own family. Desperate to avoid conflict and believing they needed to make amends for her defiance, had made a terrible decision. In their minds, she had brought dishonor that required extreme measures to correct. The entombment was meant to show the offended family that justice had been served, that Ayana had paid the ultimate price for her refusal. Thomas felt sick as the full picture became clear. They were going to let you die in there, he said, more to himself than to her. Ayana understood the tone, if not the words. She nodded sadly and drew a final image in the dirt, the sun moving across the sky 3 times. She had been sealed in that chamber for 3 days, left to die of thirst and starvation as punishment for choosing her own path. The injustice of it hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had grown up poor, working hard for everything he had, but he had always been free to make his own choices about his life. The idea that someone could be condemned to death for refusing a marriage they didn't want was beyond his understanding. That's not right, he said, his voice growing angry. Nobody deserves that, no matter what they did. Ayana watched his face and seemed to recognize his outrage on her behalf. For the first time since he had found her, she smiled slightly. It was a sad smile, but it held a glimmer of hope. Thomas stood up and began pacing the small space, his mind racing. Ayana couldn't go back to her family, that much was clear. They had already proven they were willing to kill her to preserve their honor, but where could she go? What kind of life could she have now? Ayana spoke again, pointing to the opening in the stone wall, and then to the world beyond the canyon. Her meaning was clear. She knew she could never go home again. Everything she had known, everyone she had trusted, was now lost to her. At 18 years old, she was completely alone in the world. Thomas looked at this young woman who had survived 3 days in what was meant to be her tomb, who had been betrayed by the very people who should have protected her, and felt something shift inside him. He couldn't undo what had happened to her, but he could make sure she didn't face whatever came next alone. "We'll figure something out," he said, though he wasn't sure she understood the words. But something in his tone must have conveyed his meaning, because Ayana nodded, and for the first time since he had found her, some of the fear left her eyes. Outside, the storm had passed completely, leaving the air clean and fresh. But Thomas knew that the real storm was just beginning. They had to find somewhere Ayanna could be safe, and that meant leaving this canyon and venturing into an uncertain future together. The morning sun painted the canyon walls in shades of red and gold, but Thomas felt no peace looking at the beautiful sight. Ayanna sat beside him, staring at the opening he had torn in her stone prison. They both knew they couldn't stay here forever. But leaving meant facing an unknown world full of dangers. Thomas had spent the night thinking about their options. He knew of a trading post about 2 days' ride to the north, run by a man named Fletcher, who dealt fairly with both white settlers and native tribes. If anywhere would be safe for Ayanna, it would be there. But getting there alive was going to be the challenge. "We need to go," Thomas said gently, pointing toward the canyon entrance. Ayanna understood his meaning and nodded, though fear flickered across her face. As they prepared to leave, Thomas realized how little he knew about survival in this territory from Ayanna's perspective. She might know which plants were safe to eat, where to find water, and how to read signs that he would miss completely. But she was also weak from her ordeal and terrified of being discovered by the people hunting her. He helped her onto Belle, then walked alongside the horse as they made their way out of the canyon. The morning air was cool, but Thomas knew that by midday the desert heat would be brutal. They needed to cover as much ground as possible while the temperature was still manageable. Ayanna sat stiffly on the horse at first, clearly uncomfortable with the arrangement. Thomas noticed her discomfort and tried to reassure her. "Belle is gentle," he said, patting the horse's neck. "She won't hurt you." As if understanding, Belle turned her head to look at Ayanna with calm, patient eyes. Slowly, Ayanna relaxed and even reached out to touch the horse's mane. It was a small moment, but Thomas took it as a good sign. They had been traveling for about an hour when Ayanna suddenly tensed and pointed toward a ridge in the distance. Thomas squinted against the morning sun and saw what had alarmed her. Dust clouds that could only mean riders approaching fast. "Get down," Thomas whispered, helping Ayanna slide off Belle's back. They led the horse behind a cluster of large rocks and waited. Hearts pounding, the riders passed within a few hundred yards of their hiding spot. Thomas counted at least 6 men on horseback, and even from a distance, he could see they were searching for something or someone. They moved in a pattern, spreading out to cover more ground, calling to each other in the same language Ayanna spoke. Ayanna pressed herself against the rocks, her face pale with terror. These weren't just any search party. These were people she knew, probably including members of her own family. The betrayal was written clearly on her face as she watched them pass. When the riders finally disappeared over the next ridge, Thomas and Ayanna remained hidden for another 20 minutes, to be sure they were gone. Only then did they continue their journey, but now they had to be much more careful about staying out of sight. "Family?" Thomas asked quietly, pointing in the direction the riders had gone. Ayanna nodded, her jaw set with determination and hurt. She said something in her own language that sounded bitter, then looked at Thomas. "Bad people," she said in English, using one of the few phrases she knew as they traveled. Thomas began to understand just how complicated Ayanna's situation really was. She wasn't just running from one angry family, she was an outcast from her entire community. Everyone she had ever known was now searching for her, probably believing she had somehow escaped her punishment and needed to be brought back to face it again. The thought made Thomas angry all over again, but it also made him more determined to help her reach safety. No one deserved to live in fear like this, especially not for the crime of wanting to choose her own husband. By midday, the heat was becoming unbearable. Thomas knew they needed to find shade and water soon, or they would both be in serious trouble. He had enough water in his canteens for maybe another day, but that wasn't going to be enough to reach the trading post. Ayanna seemed to understand their situation without needing words. She pointed toward a line of green in the distance that Thomas might have missed a sure sign of water. They changed direction and found a small creek running between 2 hills. Hidden from view by anyone passing on the main trail. As they rested in the shade of some cottonwood trees, Thomas watched. Ayana examined the plants growing near the water. She picked some leaves from a particular bush and showed them to him. "Good," she said, making eating motions. "Water sick? Good." Thomas realized she was showing him a plant that could help if someone got sick from bad water. She was already beginning to teach him things that might save his life out here. The knowledge humbled him. Here was someone who had been through hell, but she was still thinking about taking care of others. As the afternoon wore on, they developed a system of communication that went beyond words. Ayana would point out useful plants or signs of danger that Thomas would have missed. In return, he shared his knowledge of the territory's geography and where they might find safe places to camp. When she showed him how to read the signs that indicated water was nearby, Thomas tried to teach her some basic English words in return. "Water," he would say, pointing to the stream. "Tree," pointing to the cottonwoods. "Safe." When they found a good hiding spot, Ayana was a quick learner, repeating the words back to him with careful pronunciation. But more than that, Thomas could see her confidence growing with each new word she mastered. Language was power, especially for someone in her situation. As evening approached, they faced another difficult decision. They needed to keep moving to stay ahead of any search parties, but traveling in the dark was dangerous. One wrong step could mean a broken leg for Belle. Or worse. They compromised by continuing until full dark, then finding a sheltered spot among some large boulders where they could rest without being seen. Thomas gave Ayana his bedroll and settled himself against a rock with his rifle across his knees. He didn't expect to sleep much anyway, but sometime during the night he must have dozed off because he woke to find Ayana gently shaking his shoulder. She pointed to the eastern horizon, where the first hints of dawn were beginning to show. She had stayed awake to keep watch while he slept. The simple act of trust and care touched Thomas more than he expected. This young woman had every reason to be suspicious of everyone, especially a stranger from a different culture. But she had chosen to trust him enough to let him sleep while she stood guard. "Thank you," he said softly, and saw from her expression that she understood the meaning, if not the words. As they prepared for another day of travel, Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Getting Ayana to safety wasn't just about outrunning search parties or surviving the desert heat. It was about helping her find a place where she could build a new life, free from the fear and betrayal that had nearly killed her. The trading post was still a full day's journey away, and Thomas knew the most dangerous part of their trip still lay ahead. But looking at Ayana as she helped him pack their meager supplies, he felt something he hadn't expected: hope. They were going to make it through this together. The trading post appeared like a mirage in the afternoon heat, its wooden buildings and corrals a welcome sight after 2 days of hard travel across the desert. Thomas felt relief wash over him, but he noticed Ayana had grown tense as they approached. Her eyes darted nervously between the buildings, looking for any sign of the people who might still be hunting her. Fletcher's trading post sat at the crossroads of several well-traveled trails, making it a meeting place for ranchers, cowboys, and native traders from various tribes. Smoke rose from the chimney of the main building, and Thomas could see horses tied up outside, a good sign that meant other people were around, but also a potential danger if any of them recognized Ayana. "Wait here," Thomas said softly, gesturing for Ayana to stay hidden behind a cluster of sagebrush while he scouted ahead. He rode Belle slowly toward the main building, trying to look casual while studying everyone in sight. A few Mexican vaqueros sat on the porch, talking and drinking coffee. 2 white men were examining some leather goods, probably preparing for a long cattle drive. And near the water trough, an older native woman was watering her horse. The woman looked up as Thomas approached, and he was struck by the intelligence and kindness in her weathered face. Her long gray hair was braided with silver ornaments, and she wore a traditional Navajo dress with intricate beadwork. But what caught Thomas's attention most was the way she carried herself, with a quiet dignity that spoke of someone who had seen much and understood even more. Thomas dismounted and nodded respectfully. Afternoon, ma'am. The woman studied him, with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through him. You look like a man with troubles on his mind, young cowboy. Her English was perfect, with only a slight accent that made her words sound musical. Thomas was surprised. Not all the native people he had met spoke English so well. You could say that, Thomas admitted. Unsure how much he should reveal to a stranger, the woman continued watching him, then glanced toward the brush where Ayana was hiding. Thomas's heart skipped a beat, realizing she had somehow spotted his companion. The young woman you're protecting, the older woman said quietly. She is dying, yes? Navajo? Thomas felt his face flush. If this woman could see Ayana from here, others might too. How did you... I have lived 63 years in this territory, the woman said with a slight smile. I know the look of someone running from their past, and I know the look of someone trying to help. She studied Thomas more carefully. I am Yolanda. I work here sometimes, helping Fletcher trade with my people. What is your name? Thomas, he replied, still uncertain whether he could trust this woman. Thomas, Yolanda repeated, as if testing how the name felt. You may tell your companion she is safe here. I would like to hear her story. After a moment of hesitation, Thomas waved toward the brush. Ayana emerged slowly, her eyes fixed on Yolanda. As soon as she saw the older woman, her whole body seemed to relax slightly. Here was someone who looked familiar, who might understand her language and her situation. Yolanda spoke to Ayana in rapid Navajo, and Thomas watched as tears began streaming down the younger woman's face. It was the first time since he had found her that Ayana had been able to speak freely in her own language to someone who truly understood. They talked for nearly 10 minutes, with Yolanda asking gentle questions and Ayana responding with increasing emotion. Sometimes her voice rose in anger, other times it dropped to barely a whisper. Thomas couldn't understand the words, but he could feel the pain and relief in every syllable. Finally, Yolanda turned back to Thomas, her expression troubled. She has told me what happened to her, what her family did. The older woman shook her head sadly. This is not our way, young man. What they did to her, the entombment, this is not justice according to our traditions. Thomas felt a surge of vindication. I knew it couldn't be right. No family should do that to their own daughter. You must understand, Yolanda continued. Arranged marriages are part of our culture. They help build alliances between families, strengthen our community. But they should never be forced upon someone against their will to this extreme. She looked at Ayana with deep compassion. Her family was afraid. The man she refused to marry has powerful relatives. Rather than stand up for their daughter's right to choose, they chose what they thought was the easier path. Ayana had been listening to their conversation, understanding some of the English words Thomas had taught her during their journey. She spoke again to Yolanda, who nodded thoughtfully. She asks if she will ever be able to go home again, Yolanda translated. I have told her that home is not just a place, it is where people accept and love you for who you are. Her old home is lost to her, but she can build a new one. Over the next few hours, as the afternoon wore on, Yolanda became a bridge between Thomas and Ayana's two worlds. She explained to Thomas the complexities of Navajo society, how the tribe was struggling to maintain its traditions while adapting to the changing world around them. We are caught between two ways of living, Yolanda said as they sat in the shade behind the trading post. The old ways that kept us strong for generations, and the new ways that we must learn to survive in your world. Some of our people, like Ayana's family, become so afraid of making mistakes that they make terrible choices. Thomas learned that Yolanda herself had faced similar pressures years ago. She had been one of the first Navajo women in the area, too. Learn English and work as a cultural interpreter? Many in her community had criticized her for abandoning traditional roles. But over time, her work had proved valuable in helping her people navigate relationships with white settlers and Mexican ranchers. Change is not betrayal, Yolanda told Ayana in English, speaking slowly so the young woman could understand. Learning new ways does not mean forgetting who you are. As Yolanda spoke, Thomas could see Ayana beginning to straighten her shoulders. some of the shame and fear leaving her posture. For the first time since he had found her, she looked less like a victim and more like a survivor. Yolanda also helped Thomas understand things he had never considered before. She explained how difficult it was for Native people to maintain their identity while living in territories increasingly controlled by white settlers. Every decision, from what language to speak to what clothes to wear, carried the weight of cultural survival. "You saved her life," Yolanda told Thomas. "But more than that, you treated her as a human being deserving of respect. Many white men would not have bothered or would have expected something in return for their help." As evening fell, Fletcher, the trading post owner, offered them space to sleep in his barn. Yolanda arranged for Ayanna to stay in the small room she kept behind the main building, giving the young woman privacy and safety. Before they parted for the night, Yolanda pulled Thomas aside. "That young woman has been through something that would break most people. But she is strong, stronger than she knows. With time and patience, she will heal. The question is, what comes next for both of you?" Thomas had been wondering the same thing. Their journey to the trading post was ending, but he realized that in many ways, their real journey was just beginning. Ayanna needed time to decide what she wanted to do with her life, and Thomas needed to figure out his role in whatever came next. Looking back toward the room where Ayanna was settling in for her first safe night's sleep in weeks, Thomas felt something he hadn't expected. This experience had changed him too. He had learned that there was more to courage than facing down wild cattle or dangerous weather. Sometimes the greatest courage was simply treating another human being with kindness and respect regardless of the differences between you. Tomorrow would bring new decisions and new challenges. But tonight, for the first time since he had heard that desperate voice calling from behind the stone wall, Thomas felt like they were finally moving toward something hopeful instead of just running from something terrible. 3 weeks had passed since Thomas and Ayanna arrived at Fletcher's trading post, and the change in her was remarkable. The frightened, broken young woman Thomas had found sealed in that stone tomb was slowly disappearing, replaced by someone stronger and more confident with each passing day. Yolanda had taken Ayanna under her wing, teaching her not just better English but also how to navigate the complex world of the trading post. Every morning, Ayanna would help sort through the goods that arrived with various traders: silver jewelry from Navajo craftsmen, pottery from Pueblo artisans, leatherwork from Mexican vaqueros, and tools from white settlers heading west. Thomas watched from across the main room as Ayanna carefully examined a beautiful turquoise necklace that had come in with the morning traders. She spoke with the Navajo man who had brought it, switching easily between her native language and the English she was rapidly mastering. The trader smiled and nodded, clearly pleased with their conversation. "She has a gift for this work," Fletcher told Thomas as they stood near the counter. The trading post owner was a gruff man in his 50s, but Thomas had noticed how gentle he became when talking about Ayanna. Not just the languages, but understanding what people need. Yesterday, she helped settle a dispute between two ranchers and a Hopi trader that I thought was going to end in a fight. Thomas wasn't surprised. Even during their desperate journey across the desert, he had seen how Ayanna could read people and situations in ways that he couldn't. She had known which plants were safe, which water sources to trust, and when danger was approaching. Now she was using those same skills to help others. Fletcher continued, "Yolanda and I have been talking. We'd like to offer Ayanna a permanent position here. Not just as help around the store, but as a cultural interpreter. We get traders and travelers from all over the territory, and having someone who can really understand different perspectives, that's valuable." The offer didn't surprise Thomas either. Over the past 3 weeks, he had watched Ayanna bloom in this environment. She was no longer the scared girl hiding from her past. She was becoming someone who could build bridges between different worlds. Just like Yolanda had done, that evening, as the sun painted the desert sky in shades of orange and purple, Thomas found Ayanna sitting on the porch behind the trading post. She was working on a piece of beadwork, her fingers moving with practiced skill as she created intricate patterns in blue and silver. "Fletcher told me about the job offer," Thomas said, settling into the chair beside her. Ayanna looked up from her work and smiled. Over the past weeks, her English had improved dramatically, and she no longer struggled to find words for complex thoughts. Yes, he spoke with me this morning. Yolanda thinks it would be good for me. What do you think? Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Ayana was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. When I was sealed in that stone place, I thought my life was over. Not just because I might die, but because everything I knew, everyone I trusted, it was all gone. She paused in her beadwork to look at Thomas directly. You gave me back my life, Thomas. But here, with Yolanda and Fletcher, I am learning that I can give life back to others too. Thomas felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the evening sun. You mean helping people understand each other? Yes, Ayana said, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. Today, a young Mexican woman came here with her husband. They wanted to buy horses from a Navajo trader, but there was fear on both sides. The woman had heard terrible stories about my people, and the trader had been cheated by white men before. They were ready to walk away from a deal that would have helped both families. What did you do? Thomas asked, though he could already see the satisfaction in her expression. I talked to both of them. I helped the woman understand that the trader was honest, that he had children to feed just like she did. And I helped the trader see that this couple was not like the men who had cheated him before. Ayana smiled at the memory. They made their trade, but more than that, they talked together like human beings. The woman even invited the trader's family to visit their ranch. Thomas nodded, impressed but not surprised. This was exactly the kind of work Ayana was meant to do. You're going to accept the position, aren't you? I think so, Ayana said. But I want you to know that this doesn't mean goodbye for us. I hope you will visit when your cattle drives bring you through this area. You couldn't keep me away. Thomas replied, meaning every word over the following months. As Thomas continued his work driving cattle across the territory, he made sure his routes took him past Fletcher's trading post whenever possible. Each time he visited, he was amazed by the changes he saw in both Ayana and the trading post itself. Ayana had become Fletcher's most trusted employee, handling not just translation work but also negotiations between different groups. Her reputation for fairness and understanding spread throughout the territory. Ranchers, traders, and tribal representatives began specifically asking for her help when they needed to conduct business with people from different cultures. But more than that, Thomas could see how the work was healing something deep inside Ayana. She had found a purpose that gave meaning to everything she had suffered. The betrayal by her family, the 3 days in that stone tomb, the dangerous journey across the desert, all of it, had led her to this place where she could help others avoid the kind of misunderstanding and conflict that had nearly destroyed her life. During one visit in the fall, Thomas found Ayana teaching a group of young people, both native and white, how to communicate across cultural boundaries. She was showing them that differences in language and custom didn't have to mean fear or hostility. You know what I learned from my experience? Ayana told the group, speaking with a confidence that would have been impossible when Thomas first found her. I learned that when people are afraid, they sometimes make terrible choices. My family was afraid, and they did something they thought would protect everyone, but instead it nearly destroyed everything. Fear makes us forget that we are all human beings with the same needs: love, safety, respect. After the class ended, Thomas and Ayana walked to their favorite spot on the porch to watch the sunset. It had become a tradition during his visits, a time for them to catch up on what had happened since they last saw each other. You've changed too, Ayana observed, studying Thomas's face. When I first met you, you were just a young cowboy trying to do the right thing. Now you look at people differently. Thomas considered her words. She was right. His experience with Ayana had opened his eyes to things he had never thought about before. He found himself listening more carefully when he encountered native traders, treating them as individuals rather than as representatives of some foreign culture. He had even learned basic phrases in several tribal languages, and he always spoke up when other cowboys made ignorant comments about native peoples. You taught me that helping someone isn't just about solving their immediate problem, Thomas said. It's about seeing them as a complete person with their own hopes and dreams. You could have just accepted my help and moved on, but instead you shared your knowledge with me, trusted me with your story. That changed how I see everyone I meet. As the years passed, both Thomas and Ayanna became known throughout the territory for their integrity and their ability to bridge different worlds. Thomas eventually started his own ranch, and he made sure to hire workers from diverse backgrounds, creating a place where people judged each other by their character and work ethic, rather than their heritage. Ayanna's influence at the trading post helped transform it from just a place of business into a center for cultural exchange and understanding. Young people from various backgrounds would come there to learn from her, and many went on to become bridges between communities in their own right. The friendship between Thomas and Ayanna became legendary in its own way, proof that people from different worlds could not only understand each other, but could help each other become better than they ever could have been alone. They had both been shaped by that terrible day when he found her sealed in stone, but they had chosen to let that experience make them more compassionate, more understanding, more human. Years later, when people asked Thomas about the most important thing that had ever happened to him, he would think back to that stormy day in the canyon. He had thought he was just rescuing someone in trouble, but in reality, they had rescued each other, not just from immediate danger, but from lives that might have been smaller, less meaningful, less connected to the wider world around them.